Welcome to M Talk, brought to you by the M Scale, where we talk all things menstruation. We interview the best and brightest working across multiple fields, all with the same mission, to make the lives of people who menstruate a little bit easier. Today's episode, we're talking to Dr. Miriam Vishniac about how women experience their periods in the US prison system, and we wanted to let you know that there may be some triggering content in this discussion. Please listen with care. Good morning. Welcome to M Talk. I am so excited that you're here. I am Annabelle. I'm your host, and I'm also the founder of the M Scale, which is a company using technology and content and knowledge to sort of improve bathroom standards and reduce period anxiety. But today I'm here interviewing some incredible people doing amazing work behind the scenes in the field of menstruation. I really wanted to highlight the work they do. So without further ado, let's get into it. Today is the first half of our two-part episode exploring how women manage their periods within the prison system. With nearly 200,000 women and girls incarcerated in the USA, period management is an essential but often overlooked basic need, or even worse, in some cases with people being purposefully shamed and care items being withheld. Today, we're going to be talking to Dr. Miriam Vishniac about her research on the Prison Flow Project, a collection of documentation and knowledge that she collected whilst writing her doctorate dissertation, The New Correctional Afterthought, Menstruation and Incarceration in the USA. Miriam spent close to 6 years interviewing women incarcerated and researching the legal rights within different states in the USA, and she's published her collection of knowledge on a website, which will soon be expanding into a blog and community hub, so we're really lucky to be able to speak to her today about everything she has learnt. Welcome, Miriam.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here. To our listeners, we're recording this on Thanksgiving. I just found that out. So thank you so much for taking the time on a public holiday as well to jump online and talk to us a little bit about how women are managing their periods in prison.
No worries at all. Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, I think it might be quite helpful for our audience because we have a very international audience, literally all over the world. And I think it could be really helpful to sort of start by explaining the difference between sort of the jail system and the prison system in the USA, because it's a bit different to other countries. Would you mind sort of breaking that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The jail and prison system and the system of detainment in general in the US is pretty massive. There's websites with more specific information on it if anyone is curious. But basically, states have usually prisons which are meant to hold people who have been convicted and sentenced and who generally have longer than a year of a sentence. And jails are generally where people are sent when they haven't been convicted yet, or when their sentence is less than a year. Although there are some states that are a bit confusing because everybody does it slightly differently, where it's the same building, but it's jail versus prison sentence. But that's the very, very basic breakdown. You can also have people who are held in prison facilities because the group that has custody of them has rented the space out. So you might be in a prison, but technically you were being held by immigration agents or something like that. So you do get a variety of people depending on what the space renting agreements are that sometimes end up in prisons too.
So it sounds quite complicated, but if we were to summarize for people, you might say before you get your sentencing, you tend to be in a jail, and then after your sentencing, you go into a prison. So jail is a bit more transient, whereas prison is pretty, it's long term. You're there for a while. You're probably going to stay in the same institute for a while. Is that exactly a fair way? Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. I know, but coming from New Zealand, never really got it. I was like, because we use the word jail and prison interchangeably, I think. I might have this entirely wrong. We'll find out. But around the world, there's so many different systems, and I think we tend to get a bit confused between the sort of differentiation. So thank you for that. Before we go further into the nitty gritty of your work, I wanted to ask how you got into this field of research.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2015, I was attending George Washington University in Washington, D.C., getting my Master of Public Policy, and I just happened to be in a class that was talking about poverty in the U.S. and different kinds of social systems that we have. And around the same time, there were a couple different things that happened. So the first was that Chandra Bazalko published her opinion piece in The Guardian talking about what it was like to be someone who menstruates in York Correctional Facility, which is in Connecticut. There was also a report from the Correctional Association of New York that talked about how access to menstrual products was a significant, persistent problem. And within the context of the class I was taking, I was starting to think more about access to basic necessities and what the different issues were for different populations. And it really struck me that it seemed like there was an issue in prisons that people weren't really talking about, weren't really focusing on, where people who need access to these products weren't getting them. And it kind of just put this thought in my head that wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about it and wondering about it. And as time went by, I saw more and more reports of things like a woman in Kentucky who was sent to a court hearing without any pants because, of course, as she was being transported, she had blood on her pants, or trousers, I should say, for our international audience. And they hadn't given her anything, didn't have any replacement. She just was sent in front of a judge looking like that. And the judge was, I think, as horrified as a lot of people reading that article were. And, you know, this is in Kentucky, which is a completely different part of the US, totally different geographic region, makes it clear that this isn't just like a Northeast issue. So after years of seeing articles pop up here and there, seeing opinion pieces from these incredibly resilient people who had faced this issue themselves and were really trying to get the word out that something was going on, I came to a point where I was like, no one else that I know of is doing this research, and it seems very worth doing. It seems like there's a real problem here. I am going to get my doctoral dissertation specifically in this area because I think this needs to be talked about, and I think there's something going on here, and I want to create a resource for others to also focus on and talk about and research and really deal with what is happening.
Yeah, I don't know if you're not in the world of academia, you might not be aware of this, but it's generally PhD candidates like yourself who shed light on really important issues that start the motion of getting people to talk about things. So you dedicating 6 years of your life to this, and possibly more for the writing part. You've started this sort of waving this flag of there's something wrong here and we need to be looking into it. With that, is there a law? Is in the USA, I think in the UK it's the law now to provide period products in prisons, but is it the law in America?
So in America, what complicates it is the fact that there's federal and state prisons. So, of course, there is a federal law that covers people who are in prison that says, listen, if you are a prison that houses women, you should be providing, pads and tampons. You should be providing a variety of products in a variety of sizes. The issue is that the vast majority of women in the prison system are held in state prisons, and state by state there are sometimes laws, sometimes not, and the actual content of those laws can also vary hugely. So some states, the law is just, well, there has to be a process, but no details on what that process should be, which leaves it entirely kind of up to the facility as to how they want to handle it. And then you have other states that are quite specific, like Texas, that say you need to provide pads, you need to provide tampons. It's really up to what prison you end up in for what the actual specifics are.
So now, going forward, I'm going to ask you generalized questions, but I want to do it with the caveat that there is no general experience. So for our audience and just for this conversation, we've addressed the difference between sort of jail and prison, and then there's federal versus state, and obviously it's such a mixed bag. So rather than sort of, say, oh, but in this state it's like this, or I've heard in this prison it's like this, I'm going to ask for the sort of general discussions you've had with women, and what come to mind. So my first question is, how do women access products? How do they get their hands on them?
So for the vast majority of people, they have to purchase them. What will probably be shocking to people outside the US, hopefully, is that you are required to purchase all the basic necessities from the commissary or the prison general store. And if you are someone who menstruates, then that also includes menstrual products. If you are what the prison qualifies as indigent, basically you don't have enough funds to be able to purchase these basic necessities. They are supposed to provide them to you, but qualifying as indigent is a whole process which can take over a month, which has obvious issues if you menstruate. And so a lot of people are forced to also pay these insane costs for period products, because these are also people who are making pennies an hour. I mean, the average wages are very, very low, but they're generally expected to purchase them on top of other things. Yeah.
And I saw in your writing that actually within the prison system, the wages reduced since 2001. So the wages in prison have been reducing, and that a pack of tampons could cost a woman 2 weeks worth of wages. So that's basically saying work 2 weeks to cover your 1 week of bleeding every month. And then obviously you said they also have to purchase other basic needs, right? So if you've got half your month going towards tampons or pads, you're going to go without it. So you have to go without it at some stage, don't you? There's not enough money to provide your basic necessities. With that, how are women experiencing their periods? Not that obviously, as I said, you can have a general experience, but what are some of the themes that have come out of your conversations with women about managing their periods?
So the one thing that every single person I spoke to in my research who had experienced a period in prison said, every single one of them unanimously just talked about how they were made to beg like dogs for every single product. So in a lot of areas, they have they might have rules that if you really need a product, you can go to a guard and ask them for one. If you're just like stuck in a moment, you're not near the commissary or anything like that. But the problem with these rules is that, as everyone I spoke to described, you never just get given what you need. You always have to justify why you need a product. Usually these guards are also men, and it is particularly humiliating and difficult to have to justify needing menstrual products to a man, especially when so many of these people in prison have already faced abusive relationships. It really is deeply triggering and makes them feel extremely unsafe. And one of the just horrifying things to hear about from everybody, no matter where they were, was how unsafe they felt during this experience because of all of the different consequences they might have to deal with. It was a real strain and something they had to think about a lot more than just the few days a month or more when they actually had their periods.
Yeah, I can imagine there's a lot of sort of forethought. Like, it's already hard to have a period in general, but if you've got all of these sort of layers of accessibility issues to products, you're working 2 weeks to buy a packet of tampons, you've like it must almost be a full-time thought throughout the month preparing for bleeding, essentially. I can't remember if it was in your research or if it was in your recent webinar you did, but there was quite a lot of ignorance that was highlighted, and especially like male wardens who thought sort of like one tampon a day would suffice. Would you say that was like a sort of a common experience?
Yeah, it's fascinating. A lot of the people in charge will feel like one is enough or two are enough. And even if these were like the products that you and I have access to just by going to our local store, that wouldn't be enough. But the other thing on top of this is that the products that people have access to in prisons tend to be extremely low quality. I mean, people would talk about having to use 6 pads at a time just to make sure they didn't like bleed on themselves. You essentially have to make yourself a diaper out of pads in order to make sure they actually fulfill their intended function. And if you have access to tampons, you might have to use multiple at once, which of course increases the risk of like all kinds of infections and things. I mean, yeah, it's one of the biggest issues isn't just access, it's the fact that these items are so strictly limited in terms of number, with no recognition of the fact that they're such low quality that you go through them very, very quickly.
I can imagine that that's also leading, if you've got like, if you're worried about your supply, I imagine that women are probably using these products for a lot longer than they should. They're like pushing them to the brink. Is that a fair statement to make?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So there's a variety of items that I've heard of people using that, like, if you can access even these very poor quality menstrual products, that's at least something. I have also heard of people having to turn to dirty rags, clothing scraps, mattress stuffing as tampons, which is particularly bad because the mattresses in prisons, A, aren't regularly cleaned, but B, are treated with chemicals to make them resistant to flame and whatnot. So you're talking about people who are so desperate they're taking this mattress stuffing and inserting it inside themselves where those chemicals can get into their bloodstream, and absolutely using all of these things for much longer than the generic kind of 8-hour time period, because they don't know when they're gonna get their next product, or they're trying to really strictly limit how many they use because they only have 3 more, honestly, something like that.
Yeah, that's horrifying. And then I imagine the medical aftercare, like the sort of infections that would come from that would have a huge knock-on effect.
Yes, there was a study done by Missouri Appleseed where they looked at the rate of infection before they implemented policies around providing tampons and after. And basically, when you give people access to products that work for them and products that are actually able to fulfill their intended function and everything, the rate of infections goes down because people aren't forced to use whatever makeshift items they can find, or they don't have to use items for longer than the recommended amount of time.
Yeah. That is not surprising. I'm glad that someone has looked into that, because I imagine it's hard to get this sort of voiced and that sort of research done. But that isn't surprising. If you're putting mattress inside yourself for a long period of time, you're probably going to get a bacterial infection,
Right.
without a doubt. And then obviously access to things like painkillers or any sort of medicine or drugs to help you treat that. It can't be easy to access that either. If a tampon is hard, then painkillers must be very hard.
Yeah, I talked to one woman, Jennifer Chun from Texas, who talked about what it was like, because there's a lot of rules in prison that make it even harder to have a period. And one of them is that in a lot of places, you are punished if you don't work, if you don't do your job. So we're forcing people who have horrible, menstrual cramps sometimes and don't have access to painkillers to go out and do manual, difficult work. And like, if you say no, you get a punishment and you might end up in punitive housing. That's how it works.
Speaking of punishment, I saw somewhere that in some prisons, if you sully your clothes, like if you get a period blood on your prison gear, they could punish you for that because you've dirtied your like prison property. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a couple different things. So there's some prisons that have rules around minimum acceptable levels of personal hygiene, and very much depending on how the guard you come across feels that day, they can say, "Oh, you've bled on yourself. That's bad hygiene. That's an infraction." There's also rules against damaging or misusing facility property. So if you bleed on your prison jumpsuit, or if you bleed on your bedding or the upholstery of the chair you're on, even, like, that's technically facility property. You can be punished and charged for that, even though it was the prison's own policies that made it happen.
This is starting to sound now less like a ignorance and also not really caring, to more, it seems like a tool for coercion. Do you think the access to period products and the punishments that come can be used for control?
Yeah, I absolutely think they're used to control people. And I think, unfortunately, they can also be used as a form of abuse. There are several different cases. I think in my research, I actually found like 6 different cases where power that employees, guards have over menstrual products was specifically a tool of abuse, oftentimes sexual. And the issue is that the legal documentation doesn't always actually specifically talk about menstrual products. They frequently get lumped in with contraband because anything in excess of allowed limits is contraband, or they get lumped in with personal hygiene products. And it's only when people are interviewed by news media and talking about exactly what they went through that you find out that no, this is specifically menstrual products that we're talking about. But because that's not pulled out in legal documentation all the time, it's almost impossible to track. But it does seem, from what I've seen, there are cases all across the US of this kind of thing happening. So it seems like it is a big problem that no one is tracking, that it is used to control and can easily be turned into a weapon of abuse as well.
Have you heard any stories, across your research, any personal accounts of when women have been sort of abused or used, had their period used against them in the prison system?
Well, so I mean, yeah, it's so common that it's almost like, well, what do you want to call abuse, right? Because there's what's seen as more acceptable, which is when women are maybe in a program to try and, get good behavior and do what the facility is telling them to do. And they start to actively bleed and stain themselves, and they simply aren't given an extra product, aren't allowed to go grab products because the person in charge is like, no, you're fine, it's fine, just focus anyway and concentrate and ignore the fact that we're making you sit there and humiliate yourself, which, isn't nearly as intense as some of the abuse that you hear about, but I would say still certainly counts as a pretty unacceptable form of control. There's a pervasive threat that people talked about just kind of hanging over their head, that if you ask for anything, you might be asked for something in return. That's just something that everyone at every facility that people had been to talked about just being a part of having your period. Like you have to understand that if you turn to anyone around you for assistance, you'll be punished or maybe something worse. So in a lot of places, even where there wasn't actual abuse that people had necessarily experienced themselves, it was still a very possible thing that could happen, and people would go out of their way to try and just like handle things on their own to avoid that. And that's, of course, when you get women using all kinds of makeshift products instead of even trying to ask for more. There are a lot of instances that people talked about where guards would just make harassing, terrible, disgusting comments about how people are forced to walk around with menstrual blood stained clothing because, of course, in America, we don't really give people as much clean clothing as they might need. We don't even give them the opportunity to shower every day, depending on where they are. And so you're left for potentially multiple days with these blood stains on you. And guards will absolutely make comments about it. And they talked about that as particularly frustrating because it doesn't rise to the definition of abuse that's legally actionable, but it still has a very real impact on the people who are living their day like that, just being openly harassed.
Yeah, I think if the general population suffer from menstruation stigma and not feeling like, and all of these sort of period equity and accessing products and all of that in general life, then I imagine it is compounded hugely within the prison system, and that there's also a lot of issues, right? These women are facing, this is a big issue for them, but they are facing a lot of degradation, coercion, control, abuse. So potentially, it might not be this in hindsight, but potentially in the moment, do you think they don't really even consider it like a huge affront at the time? Or is it just something to survive? Or what do you think?
I have talked to people who have talked a lot about having to compartmentalize and just push it aside and not even register in the moment how unacceptable and uncomfortable and unfair it is, because it's just one out of many, and you can't focus on everything. It's just too much. If you're going to survive, if you're going to get through, you have to kind of just like lock down and keep going. And it's especially crazy to hear people talking about that at the same time as we have people talking about programming that's supposed to help women with their self-worth and their self-esteem, and how that's possibly related to how successful people are once they're released from prison, but the facilities themselves are inflicting this terrible, awful pain that is undercutting all of those efforts.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like it's potentially all talk, whereas in action it's not really happening for these women. And it's supposed to be about rehabilitation, right? But it's pretty hard to be rehabbed in that sort of abusive system, I can imagine. Yeah. In your research, you had an interesting thing, and I'll be the first to say that correlation does not equal causation, but you did have a sort of look at post-prison outcomes, and you found that women who were in systems that had good access to products, if you could call it good, but fairly all right access to period products, tend to have better outcomes once they'd left the prison system. I would love to hear more about what you think about that.
I think that we don't fully understand or acknowledge what a big deal menstruation is at the best of times. But yeah, as I said before, especially when you have research that's claiming that self-esteem is a huge factor for people who are trying to have success after leaving prison, after being released. I've talked to women who talked about how it was yet another thing they had to get over, of just like feeling comfortable in their bodies, feeling comfortable taking care of themselves when they were menstruating, feeling comfortable, voicing their needs, and just like getting the products they needed. And how, even if they didn't think about it a lot at the time, it does leave a mark. And it's yet another thing that is kind of another barrier that people have to overcome when they get released. And again, especially for people who have already struggled generally with abuse as children and generally also domestic violence, intimate partner abuse, like forcing them to relive these patterns of very highly gendered abuse is it just boggles the mind when you're watching it happen from in the same facilities that claim to be gender responsive and, trying to address these specific needs.
Yeah. Have you found in your research, have you found any prisons that are doing it all right, that tend to be better? They're trying, they're actually trying, or is it all sort of a very grim landscape?
So I would say there are prisons that have generally good rules around providing access to products. And this is another thing I think is really, really important to focus on, which is that a lot of people think solving this issue just means putting through legislation that there should be access and that there should be a variety of products in a variety of sizes and absorptions. And having a rule or a law is absolutely better than not having one. But I can't stress enough that that's not where this ends. That's just the first step. And the second step is making sure it is followed, having enforcement mechanisms, having ways that the people who are supposed to be getting access can alert others if that's not what's happening. Because you get states like Alabama, which had, that is one of the states that had very much menstrual product driven abuse where, and this is hard to hear and I apologize, women were basically having menstrual products held over their heads and had to deal with terrible sexual abuse if they wanted to get access, which is awful. And there were lawsuits, there was a Department of Justice investigation about it. And after that, they implemented a law that was basically supposed to be like, there's a cupboard you can go to that has all the toilet paper you might need, because also women aren't getting more toilet paper than men are getting. That's a huge problem and compounding factor. But it was supposed to be that you could just go to this cupboard, get what you need, wasn't a problem. But when nobody is monitoring or enforcing these rules, another researcher I've talked to, Reagan Moss, who's amazing, has actually talked to women who've been in those facilities and who are saying, yeah, it's nice that there's a rule, but when nobody checks up on it, things don't really change. We still don't have access. The cupboard isn't kept stocked. It's seen as just kind of an extra task that people aren't always actually following up on and doing what they're supposed to. So yeah, you do have places that have better rules around this, but there needs to also be enforcement, oversight, transparency, all the things that unfortunately generally the US carceral system is lacking.
Yeah, I just want to go back to that briefly because that's quite a bombshell.
Yeah.
Pads and tampons were being used as a coercive tool for sexual abuse, essentially, is what you're saying. So,
yeah,
I mean, this is me just responding to this horrendous news. Like, I didn't realize that. Obviously, menstrual products are so integral if you menstruate that what you're willing to do to get access to them is absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, I apologize because it's hard. It's such a dark subject and it's hard to bring up, but it's also, I think, so important to make that correct connection explicit, because that's not even the only place where that kind of behavior happened. There was also a case in New York. There's also been women who've talked about this kind of thing in New Jersey and in California. Like, it very clearly seems like a widespread problem, and there's a lot of connections that just aren't being made by people on the outside. And it is so important to recognize that, like, when you dehumanize people, when you allow this horrific sexist behavior that we wouldn't accept for women in any other area, but somehow we allow it in our system of justice, this is part of what happens.
Yeah. We're going to take a little break on that point to talk you through some of the latest developments in women's health. You may not have heard these stories in the news, which is why we are going to bring them directly to you. Stay tuned. In a landmark decision, Karnataka has become the first Indian state to grant paid menstrual leave to women workers in both government and private sectors. The policy, approved by the state government this October, allows women employees one paid day off per month. That's 12 days a year specifically for menstrual health. State officials say the move recognises menstrual well-being as a legitimate workplace concern and aims to create a more inclusive work environment. Karnataka isn't alone in this. States like Bihar, Kerala have similar provisions in the public sector, and globally, countries like Japan, South Korea and Spain already have menstrual leave policies in place. Advocates are calling it a major step in destigmatising menstruation and supporting women's health at work. Critics, however, warn that careful implementation is needed to avoid unintended consequences. They worry the policy could lead to hiring discrimination, workplace bias and privacy concerns. Either way, Karnataka's decision marks a significant shift in workplace rights across India. And in England, women can now get the morning after pill free of charge at nearly 10,000 high street pharmacies. The new NHS England scheme allows women to simply walk into a participating pharmacy, speak confidentially with a pharmacist and receive emergency contraception on the spot, without needing to see their GP or visit a sexual health clinic. Officials are calling this one of the biggest changes to sexual health services since the 1960s, a decision aimed at making reproductive healthcare more accessible and equitable across the country. But it's not just emergency contraception. Community pharmacies are expanding their role significantly. They now offer contraceptive pill prescriptions, repeat supplies, and support for people newly prescribed antidepressants. Pharmacies can also provide prescription-only medicines for common conditions like urinary tract infections, sinus infections, and earaches without requiring a GP visit first. The move is part of the NHS's 10-year health plan to shift care into the heart of communities, with 4 in 5 people living within a 20-minute walk of a pharmacy. More people can now access timely sexual and reproductive health support without delays or extra steps. And here's a breakthrough in women's health that might surprise you, as if it's not surprising at all. Researchers and startups are now looking at period blood, long dismissed as medical waste, as a major new opportunity for diagnostic testing. A company in California has collected thousands of used tampons sent in by volunteers. They're turning them into preserved samples for lab analysis. The goal? To use menstrual blood to screen for conditions like endometriosis, which is currently only diagnosable through invasive surgery. But the potential goes much further. Scientists say this approach could also help detect hormonal imbalances, certain cancers, and metabolic problems. Why menstrual blood? Because it contains tissues and fluids directly from the uterus, information that traditional blood tests simply cannot capture. One researcher calls it a biological sample that delivers messages to doctors that other bodily fluids may not. Wow! Who would have thought? The idea is still experimental, but if it succeeds, it could transform how women access diagnostic testing. Imagine a non-invasive, at-home method that could catch serious conditions years earlier than current approaches allow. As one industry leader put it, this may be the most overlooked opportunity in women's health. I was going to ask you if you had any stories that really stayed with you through your research. I don't know if you want to highlight one or two at this point, or
I think one of the things that I would say again is just the fact that every single person I talked to who had experienced a period in prison, no matter where they were, whether it was like Texas or Arizona or New York State or anything like that, every single one of them talked about having to beg like dogs to get what they need. And that really sticks with me, and I still think about it all the time because it's just such an unacceptable way to treat people in general. It's so horrifying, and it is so horrifying to see that behavior just accepted as totally fine in our system of justice. But when it comes to specific stories too, it's the stories of women who've been punished, sometimes quite harshly, just for having a period or daring to have like medical issues related to that period. So there was a woman in Florida that I spoke to, Uraida Guanipa, um, who talked about just like really struggling, constantly bleeding. Because the other thing that one woman told me from Arizona was that, we think about periods as being a once a month problem, but that's if you're healthy. And prison is a very hard place to be healthy. And the stress alone is a huge impact on the menstrual cycle. And it just ends up being a real problem. And in the case in Florida, she was bleeding and having real issues and having like other medical problems, and they put her in punitive housing because she was refusing to work and I think she had a doctor's note that she couldn't work far away from a bathroom, and that was like the prison saw it as a problem. It's so enraging to think about having to justify the reason why you need access to these basic necessities, and especially having to justify that need to people who see you as less than human. And it really affected them as women. They felt not only like they were seen as less than human and less than a normal person and horrible because they'd done something wrong, but also very specifically that they were being punished as women because they had done something wrong, and it made them feel worse about themselves as women specifically. And I can't imagine ever having to deal with something like that. I listen to what these women talk about, and I don't know that I would have been able to go through the same thing without just absolutely losing my mind.
Yeah, a little plug, not a plug, but as I mentioned, this is a 2-part episode, and our next episode we're talking to Reality Winner, who spent close to 4 to 5 years, 5 to 6 years. Her sentence was 6 years, but I think she got out a bit early. Anyway, she spent time in county jail and also a prison, and she's coming on to talk about in more detail the sort of abuse that she saw and her first-hand experience, but just what it did to her, the woman that was surrounding her as well. We'll have a bit more of that personal insight as well. On this, you're doing a lot of work still around trying to improve the situation, raise awareness around the situation. So I know that you're sort of turning your information hub that you have into a bigger sort of community. Do you want to tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, actually, we're in the process of incorporating as a nonprofit. So I'm trying to really create a space. And normally this is something that might happen at a university. It might be like a research initiative, but universities in the US are undergoing their own kind of crisis at the moment, especially in terms of funding, especially in terms of funding for things that are seen as political, which apparently includes women's health a lot of the time. So I'm just trying to create a space that is a resource for other researchers, for advocates and organizers, and for people who are just trying to do the work on the ground and really push for change. I'm trying to create a platform with the blog where people who have experienced this directly can talk about what they went through in a place that makes it accessible for others, that puts it all in a single location so that people can really understand. It's not Periods are not a niche thing. It's not an issue once a month that's kind of problematic. This is something that is hugely affecting people and that they have to deal with almost every single day. And it's my hope that creating this space will really allow a lot of people to use it as a resource for change, for further research, for all kinds of things. And I'm really excited to be able to help create that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to help reform state by state, I imagine you have to pick away the pieces state by state. We had a episode talking with Period about schools trying to get period products in schools, and they sort of mentioned it's quite hard in the States because you're kind of having, you've got 50 different battlefronts. It's all, every single one is different. So I imagine it's the same thing with a sort of reform work that you want to see in prisons about just having access to period products. It's so simple. It's so basic, you would think.
It's so basic, and it's not, just having a rule can make such a difference, even if that doesn't fix everything. And it is so deeply frustrating when people react, as they did in Arizona, to hearing about, there was one of the women I spoke to, Adrienne Kitchian, actually testified in front of the legislature there, and one of the male legislators, of course, just looked at her and said, "You're a liar because you've been in prison and we have no reason to take your word for it, and clearly everything's fine," which is such a frustrating thing to see. People who've been in prison aren't actually at all proven to lie more than anyone else. And when I hear people say, "Oh, they did something wrong, they deserve to be treated badly," I have to just keep looking at people and being like, this isn't about the crime they've committed. This is about the fact that they happen to menstruate, and that's just seen as like an acceptable thing to use to control and abuse people. And this isn't about like what you've done, it's about who you are. And I genuinely think there are consequences to all of us when we allow anyone who menstruates to be treated this way.
Yeah, there's definitely, it's the stripping away of humanity, like you said, is kind of a really sad symptom of our current society as well, isn't it? It's not looking good if people can say things like that and say, well, they deserve to be treated that way because they committed a crime. I can't imagine also at the moment in the States that the current political environment is helping this cause in any way, as you sort of mentioned.
Yeah, it's certainly, we have swung into a place where politically there's a lot of focus on punishment and trying to punish people by denying their very humanity. And again, I think there are just real, tangible consequences for that, no matter who you are. And it is an unfortunate symptom of everything that's happening right now, and I don't think it will get us to a safer place. If the point of prisons is about public safety, dehumanizing the people who happen to end up there is never a part of that.
I don't know how to finish this on a hopeful note. Do you know how to finish this on a hopeful note?
So, on a hopeful note, I will say, and especially at a time when it just seems like there's a lot of bad things happening in general, and I suppose trying to channel what I consider to be the real spirit of Thanksgiving, which is acknowledging the ways we have acted that have hurt groups of people, and trying to actually come together, give them a seat at the table, and address that. I think we are at a difficult point for a lot of people. I think mass incarceration is part of what has gotten us there. And I think when people talk about the current situation we're in and how to address it, I absolutely think that addressing mass incarceration has to be a part of that. If you talk about caring about democracy, using prisons to warehouse people has a clear impact on democracy, very clear. And I would say the thing about the prison system in the US is that it feels impossible to do anything about because it's so big, it's so pervasive. One of the reasons I went abroad to do my doctoral dissertation is because I wanted to get out of that bubble where it's just kind of seen as like, this is what's necessary and how things just are, because it doesn't have to be how things are. We take that for granted very much in the US. And there's a lot of thinking about that I've done. And I think change is always possible, even if it is deeply difficult. And I think there's a reason it's difficult, which is because a lot of people profit off of the system as it is. I think when I am looking at how we can really address this issue, it has to be more than just a Band-Aid. It has to be a rethinking of our criminal justice system, our systems of detainment, and how they don't make us any safer. If we want to address menstrual equity, the treatment of people who menstruate in prison, step one is creating laws that demand access to these products. Step two is ensuring oversight and accountability. Step three is dealing with all of the contributing factors, like the poor healthcare that people get in prison, which absolutely affects people who menstruate too, the fact that people are forced to buy all the basic necessities, those kinds of things. And then step four is understanding that we really need to stop mass incarceration. We need to provide access to social services outside of prison, stop using that as an excuse to put people away, and understand that this is not sustainable in any healthy democracy. It's hard, but it's possible. Prisons are not an inherent part of human life. They were invented a couple hundred years ago, and we should remember that, because if we can understand that they weren't just always around, then maybe we can better understand that they don't need to keep being around in the same form. They don't need to be as huge and big as we seem to think they always have been and always will be. There is a different way.
Okay. And I really look forward to seeing the work that you're going to do with the Prison Flow Project, imagining that different way. We're going to link all of your resources here on the episode notes. If anyone wants to see more about sort of this incredible wealth of information that you've collected, or contribute as you start to grow out your blog and your community. And it is a topic that I'm going to start very much advocating for after learning about this. I've always been sort of a menstrual justice warrior, if you will, but particularly the treatment of women in prison with period products and the incarceration of women. I'm just going to have to add that to my belt after this episode, because it definitely needs to change. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for getting in touch and asking me to come have this conversation with you. I'm always happy to just talk about this and educate others, because it is so deeply important, and we gotta start talking about periods more everywhere.
Absolutely. That was an incredibly heavy but an incredibly insightful conversation, and clearly there is a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to the treatment of women in the prison system, and especially around access to period products and the shame and degradation that seems to come with it. I'm so appreciative of Dr. Miriam Vishniac for coming on and for all the work that she's doing. We have linked her work in the episode notes to this episode, so if you want to go and check out the Prison Flow Project, you can. And once again, thank you so much for listening. Please share, talk about this. I mean, this is definitely worthwhile conversation at the pub or Christmas dinner with your family. I don't know if you want to ignite any fiery debates, but there you go. Tune in to next week. We're going to be talking to Reality Winner about her lived experience within the county jail and the prison system. Until then, ciao.